Hey there, folks. We're almost done with our story of Capricorn, David, and the Davidic covenant. You can see I'm in a hotel room again, just landed here in California. So I'm trying to get this recorded for you guys before fellowship shows up tomorrow morning. Now, last week we talked about Saul and how he was crowned king on Pentecost. And I don't think that's an irrelevant detail since God himself became the king of Israel at the first Pentecost on Mount Sinai a little bit more than 400 years ago. And this was a detail that I had missed, the many times that I've read through, Kings and Samuel. I've not really come upon that detail, but as over the years, as I've continued to study and the feast days have become more meaningful to me, I've started to look for patterns. And really, of course, it was Tim that started all this when he published a couple of his books, and we did some of our earlier studies like the Noseworthy, as well as the Time of the End. We started to see that historically, God has done some very, very important things on feast days, right? Whether it's Passover and the death and the resurrection of Christ, the Feast of First Fruits, and all that kind of stuff. Well, we also talked last week about Saul's impatience and his lack of trust in God, and talked about the story where the Amorites gathered against him, and he was supposed to wait for 7 days for the prophet Samuel to come and tell him what God's will was, whether or not he was to go to war. But as the Amorites' superior force and army got closer, Saul started to panic, and he took it upon himself to make his own sacrifice to God, and that's considered what we consider to be an unauthorized sacrifice. But his hastiness and his disobedience had a tremendous cost for him personally, as well as his dependents, because it literally cost him and his descendants the throne of Israel. And I pointed out that according to the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, God had been willing to let the tribe of Benjamin and the descendants of Saul hold the throne forever until Saul did this unauthorized sacrifice. Now, just before we see David enter the picture as a young boy, Saul continues in his streak of disobedience. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, God sends Samuel against the Amalekites, telling him not to spare anyone, any person, or any animal. But in verse 9 in chapter 15, and I'm not going to read it, I'm just going to point out some things. And in fact, I want you to be prepared for this lesson today, because there's so much in the story of David that we could literally spend probably a couple of months if we stopped and dwelt on each individual story. There are so many stories that are embedded within this story of David itself. But in chapter 15, verse 9, we see Saul sparing King Agag and the best of the animals, right? So Saul goes to war, and God says, don't spare anybody or anything. And Saul spared King Agag, and he spared the best of the animals. And when he was confronted by Samuel, Saul lied. In fact, he lied a couple of times, saying that it was the people who spared them, not he himself, and that they did so to sacrifice the animals to the Lord. And as if that was going to calm down the ire of God when, thinking that God in heaven is going to go, oh, for me? And then he's going to be okay with Saul being disobedient. At that point, Samuel confirms that God has torn the kingdom from Saul's hands and that he was going to be replaced. And in that story, if you go back and you read that, it seems like Saul repents. He convinces Samuel to attend him as he gives some sacrifices to God, and it seems like all is well. But at the end of chapter 15, we see in verse 35, if you're there in your Bible, you can go there. It says, and Samuel went no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So here's a question to ponder. Did God not know how things would work out with Saul? Now, over the last several years, particularly as we've been forced through our studies to change our opinion and change our position on things like, the nature of man, the nature of God, and all the things that I know our home fellowship is very well aware of. We've talked and we've shown you so many different places where it's quite evident that the pre-incarnate Christ is learning as he goes. And in fact, even in the introduction, the first few lessons of this particular series, I said several times about in the beginning, the pre-incarnate Christ had no experience with his own creation, and he didn't have, even though he's of the same essence as the Father, he doesn't have the same capacities in terms of omniscience and being able to see into the future and know all things the way that his Father does. So on the surface, it does seem like, if you go back to this statement, that the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. On the surface, it seems like it's a statement of God's emotional response to Saul's failure as king. And there certainly, I think, is an element of that, but it's not necessarily confined to that. And in fact, my opinion is it's not necessarily that in its entirety. And I think that this discussion is important for a couple of reasons. First, we can recognize that God, even though he is divine, is an emotional being. He's neither cold and dispassionate nor cunning and calculating. He cares. He can rejoice. He feels joy. He can be angry. He can be disappointed, and he can experience regret. But it also shows God's faithfulness to his own words. And it prevents us from falling into this trap of, thinking that God is fumbling his way through the future as the future unfolds. And there's, I don't know that I can say that there's a danger, but there is, and I'm blanking on the phrase right now, but there is a small group within Christianity that believes that God has no foresight, and he is making decisions on a moment-to-moment basis based on the actions of humanity. There is a formal term for that. It's blank. It's escaping me, and I'm just blanking on it. But let me get back to this word regret, because if I say, "Oh, I regret that," I'm pretty sure that every single one of you that's listening and watching understands what we mean by the word regret, right? It's an emotional response. It's a certain way of thinking in the negative, almost like, "Oh, that shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't have done that." But I need to point out that feeling regret doesn't necessarily imply being blind to the future or to an outcome of an action or a scenario. As human beings, sometimes you've got to do something, maybe as a parent or as a business leader or some other role in life, that you would rather not do, but that you have to, or that in between where you are and the result that you're looking for, there's something that needs to be done that you would rather not do, but you have to do it. So you do it because you need to get on the other side and get to the consequences that you're looking for. Even though that the negative outcome, or not the negative outcome, I'm fumbling through my this is a difficult concept to try to explain, but hopefully you guys are understanding what I'm saying. Feeling regret, even though something is coming and your choice is for the best and it's inevitable anyways, we can do something, regret that we have to do it, but do it anyways. And I think God is apparently the same way. Now, to my second point, the first point being God feels what we call human emotions. In fact, it's probably the other way around. We feel the same emotions that God feels, right? Because we are his creation. The second point that I made about this word regret, I kind of linked it to God sticking to his plan and sticking to his words. And I say this because the Greek word, as well as the Hebrew, but I think more specifically, the Greek word in the Septuagint that is translated as regret can also mean to change one's mind. And it has nothing to do with the emotionality, but it literally is a changing of one's disposition. I want you to go 1 Samuel 15, verse 9. Actually, I'm sorry, it's verse 11. And I'll put this up on the screen here. I'm just going to pick it up in verse 9, but there are three different verses where the same Greek word is used, and in two occasions, or two of those verses, it's translated as regret, and in one of those, it's translated as relent, and I'll explain how they all link together here in a second. But in this chapter, in 1 Samuel 15, verse 9, but Saul and the people spared Agag, this is the story we've been talking about, and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them, but everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Saul, and he cried out to the Lord all night. Now, I do want to point out, and I've got this up on the screen there, where it says in verse 11, I greatly regret. You'll notice that I've got the word greatly lined out. That's simply because the Septuagint does not have the word greatly, because if you read that in the English, I greatly regret, it does seem to be speaking about his emotional response, like, oh no, I shouldn't have done that. In the Septuagint, it just simply says, I regret, or I have regret that I've set up Saul as king. Now, skip down to verse 35 here, and we'll see the same type of translation, and it's the same Greek word. The word is parakaleo. This is after Samuel confronts Saul, and Samuel ends up killing Agag himself, because that was what God had commanded to be done. Then he announces that God is going to take away Saul's kingship. And in verse 35, and Samuel went no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Now, I said just a moment ago, this word that's translated in these two verses as regret is parakaleo. It's also translated in verse 29, which we'll see in a second, as the word relent. And this word parakaleo literally means to call back or to call beside. If you remember, I guess a year or so ago, we talked about election and being called. And we talked about this word calling being kaleo. So parakaleo, the preposition para means beside or bringing back. So parakaleo means to call back. It's almost like, if you're familiar with the term in golf, a mulligan. A mulligan is where you take a shot that doesn't turn out the way that you want, and typically you get one mulligan and you can do that shot over again. Now, essentially what God is doing here is he's claiming his right to terminate Saul's stewardship based on the conditions of that arrangement. And the conditions of Saul's stewardship was that Saul was going to obey and trust God, which is exactly what he had not been doing in several very important circumstances, right? And the basis of God's choice is stated immediately in verse 11, where he says, I greatly regret, or I regret that I set Saul up as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And again, so what we see in verse 11 and verse 35 is God stating that he is calling back or taking back his decision to set Saul as king, because Saul was not holding up his end of the agreement. It's as much a statement of God's judgment, his decision, and his actions. It's as much that, perhaps even more, than a statement of God's emotional response. And I think there's a really, really big difference between those two. Now, remember that the kings of Israel, both the kings of Israel and Judah, were given those positions as stewards, right? Temporary authority to govern and rule until the true king returns. Now, take that and go down to verse 29, or go back to verse 29, because I think we were in 35 there. And we see the same Greek and Hebrew words, the Greek word being parakaleo, and here they're translated differently, right? It's the exact same word, but it's translated differently, and it's translated as relent. Verse 28, we'll pick it up there. So Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. And also the strength of Israel, which is just a title for God, the strength of Israel will not lie or relent, for he is not a man that he should relent. Now, if this word is intended to denote God's emotional response of regret, the way that we define and use regret, at least in this modern day, that would completely make verse 29 not make any sense whatsoever, right? Now, the Septuagint captures this just a little bit better. He will neither turn back nor change his mind, because he is not like humanity that he should change his mind. Basically, he's saying that God is not wishy-washy like humans are, right? We make decisions, we make oaths, we say we're going to do this, something doesn't turn out the way we want, and we change our mind and we go do something else. God's not like that. Now, there is patience and forbearance, there is mercy, there is grace, there's all of those things. But when God decides something's going to happen, then it's going to happen. So when we put all of these things together, we see this picture. We see that God will not change his mind about following through on consequences in serious situations of great importance. And if he puts someone in a position of authority on condition of obedience and trust, if those conditions are breached, then God reserves the right and will change his mind about continuing with that person under those circumstances. And I think that that's what these 3 verses are really talking about. They're not talking about God's emotionality. They're talking about the fact that when Saul transgressed, when he was disobedient and distrustful, God said, I'm invoking my right according to our agreement to take you and your family and the entire tribe of Benjamin off the throne of Israel. Now, I do believe that God feels emotions like we do. And like I said, we feel his emotions rather than he feeling human emotions like regret or anger or joy or other things. Again, this seems to be a lot more about God's resolve that God has to perform what he said he was going to do. And in this case, the stakes are the highest of all, being the commander over the inheritance of the Lord. In fact, from a human positional or authority and leadership perspective, there is no position or role on earth ever throughout all the entirety of human history that is more important and bears more responsibility than being the commander or the steward of the inheritance of the Lord, right? And here we are in the midst of the modern world, and it's quite commonly said that the President of the United States is the most powerful man in the world. And that's probably true when you define it, but the most important position in the world that has ever been, will ever be, is the commander or the steward of the inheritance of God. Now, we have to deal with another issue related to some of these statements that actually doesn't really become an issue until a little bit later in David's story. But if you notice in verse 28, Samuel said that God was giving the kingdom to someone who was better than him. So I want you to pause for a second and ask yourself, better in what way? Was David morally perfect? Was David morally more pure than Saul? The answer is no. One of David's biggest mini stories is seducing the wife of his loyal friend Uriah. He gets her pregnant, and then he has Uriah killed to cover her sin. So in that sense, was David any better than Saul? No, not a chance, right? He was just as deplorable in that sense. But I want you to notice the context of some of these statements, right? Saul turned back from following God and did not perform God's commandments as the steward and as the commander of the inheritance. That's the measuring stick, not moral equivalence, right? Are you a better, more pure person in your personal actions than somebody else? So God's laws have always made provisions for imperfect people, and that would include the king of Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't any consequences. Saul had the kingdom ripped from his hands, but David's baby with Bathsheba, the baby that he impregnated another man's wife with, died. And in fact, David himself lost 4 sons in total for the mistakes that he made. So justice indeed was served, both with Saul and both with David. But in the midst of all of these different things, in the midst of losing son after son after son, David never turned away from God. In fact, David turned towards him. When his son with Bathsheba was ill, David fasted and prayed and ultimately, calmly and without reservation, accepted God's will and accepted God's judgment. Let's go to 2 Samuel 12, verse 15. The story of Bathsheba and David having Uriah, her husband, killed is in chapter 11. It's actually a very short story, and of course, much can be said about that, but I'm not, in this particular series, I'm not going to go through that. In the beginning of chapter 12, God sends Nathan the prophet to King David. Now, obviously, we fast forwarded in the scope of David's story. Don't worry, we're going to go back and talk about some other things coming up excuse me, coming up here in just a little bit. But in chapter 12, God sends Nathan the prophet to King David to tell him a story of a poor man who had this little lamb that he loved like his own child, and he treated it literally like a baby. It was the only possession, and I would imagine the only love that poor man experienced. Now, the poor man has this rich neighbor, and the rich neighbor comes and he takes the poor man's lamb and kills it to feed a traveler who would come visiting. And he did it because the rich man didn't want to use one of his own lambs to feed a traveler, and so he took the poor man's. Now, when David heard this, he was absolutely outraged, and he pronounced that the rich man who took the poor man's lamb would restore fourfold what he took from the poor man. And of course, Nathan then tells him, David, the rich man is you. And this is where God pronounces judgment that he was going to lose his own sons because he had taken what belonged to somebody else, right? And he pronounces in verse 11 here, he pronounces God's judgment. Nathan says, thus says the Lord, and this is after he explained that David is the rich man. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. Now, later in the story, David marries Saul's daughter, Michal, and as David is running around the countryside trying to escape Saul, because Saul is trying to kill him, we'll go back to this a little bit later, Saul actually gives his daughter, Michal, who is David's wife, gives her to somebody else. And so, we don't know, I don't know the legality and how they worked all this stuff out, but Michal was at once married to David and married to another man. And this, went on for quite some time. In verse 12, for you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. So David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. He's taking responsibility for his actions. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. However, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also who is born to you shall surely die. Right? That price is something that no parent would ever want to pay. Now, the statement that Nathan makes in verse 14, where he says, you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, this is bone-chilling to me. Have you ever had a conversation with an unbeliever, maybe an atheist, certainly a critic of the Bible, that points out how Christians are hypocritical, right? Professing one thing with their mouths and their bumper stickers, but living a life that's inconsistent and incompatible with God's Word. In fact, I had my sister make mention of this to me when we were home over the holidays. Now, everybody struggles with something, including me, but there's a line between the gap where the gap between our actions and our words is so wide, and it's so obvious, and it's so out there for everybody to see that it gives God a bad reputation. David was like that. And that's, I think, the reason why this story with Bathsheba is so important for us to look at and to understand, is that David, as much as we like to think about the upside of his story and how he was a God after man's own heart, he made a lot of mistakes on a personal level that makes him just like you and me. The difference between you and me is that for the majority of his life, he was the steward and the king of the Lord's inheritance. Verse 15, after Nathan pronounces God's judgment, then Nathan departed to his house, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became ill. David therefore pleaded with God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. So the elders of his house arose and went to him to raise him up from the ground, but he wouldn't, nor did he eat food with them. Then on the seventh day it came to pass that the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, indeed, when the child was alive, we spoke to him, and he wouldn't heed our voice. How can we tell him that the child is dead? He may do some harm. When David saw that his servants were whispering, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "He is dead." So David arose from the ground, washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes, and he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. And I think that verse 20 captures the major differences between Saul and David. So they're different responses to correction, different degrees of recognition of God's sovereignty, different degrees of obedience and trust. That's why Saul had the kingdom ripped from his hands and it was given to somebody else. Now, if you go back to verse 11, notice that Nathan says to David the same thing that Samuel said to Saul. Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord, right? After all, Saul had the kingdom ripped out of his hands because he despised the commandments. He didn't do what God told him to do. So why have you, I can't tell with my notes here if it was verse 9 or verse 11, but why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? So here's a question again to ponder. If the accusation, despising the commandment of God, is the same for Saul and David, why didn't God rip the kingdom from David's hands just like he did Saul? Because one of the things in our ministry is that we talk about God's consistency, right? He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So if on the surface it seems like two men did the same thing, despised the commandment of the Lord, after all, that's what the words say, why didn't God take the kingdom away from David, right? Now, there were other men from the tribe of Judah that God could have chosen to fulfill Jacob's prophecy about the line of Judah producing the Messiah. Both men despised the commandment of the Lord, just using the terminology in the translation. So again, why did God let David continue with the kingdom and Saul not? Now, I think it's important to point out that God's distinctions between Saul and David have to do with how they executed their roles and responsibilities as the commanders of the inheritance of the Lord, as these stewards that we've been talking about. Now, I said earlier that neither man was morally perfect, but Saul's failure that he was punished for was as king and steward of the Lord's inheritance, not as an everyday Jew under the law of Moses, right? While Saul failed as the steward of the inheritance, the commandments that David transgressed, that he was punished for, were the same laws that applied to any citizen of Israel that all men of Israel had to follow. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. Do not murder, right? These were transgressions not of stewardship, but they were transgressions of personal and moral law, right? Not turning away from following the commands that governed his behavior as king or as steward. Two completely different scenarios. And while for the most part the law requires the people to exact justice, right? Go back and read through the book of Leviticus and look at all the rules and the laws that were stated there. And in many cases, it was the people that were required to exact justice. Even though the stories of, say, things like Korah's rebellion, we see the people exacting justice according to the requirements of the law. But when David transgressed the personal moral laws, instead of the people exacting vengeance on David, God did it himself, because David transgressed the personal moral law while he was the steward, while he was the commander, and he was the king. So God took over and he executed judgment himself. And so I hope you understand the differences between why God pulled the kingdom from Saul and not from David. They both disobeyed the commandments of the Lord, but they were two different sets of commandments. One were commandments of the steward, and the others were the personal and the moral law that was associated with the Mosaic covenant. So now there's another major difference between David and Saul that shows exactly why David was a man after God's own heart. Now, I'm going to warn you, I'm probably going to go a little bit over because I'm trying to cover a certain amount of material so I can finish off in a single session next week. You remember how Saul made the unauthorized sacrifice because he was terrified of that much larger army that was coming to fight against him. He didn't trust the timing and the protection of God, and he disobeyed. I want you to go to 1 Samuel 15, verse 22. God had made it very clear what was expected from the king of Israel right after that incident where Saul didn't kill King Agag and they kept all the good stuff for themselves. So 1 Samuel 15, verse 22. So Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king." Of course, this is the problem that Jesus much later had with the Pharisees, right? Performing rituals, perhaps to perfection, but with disobedient and rebellious hearts. Over the last few years, I've come to appreciate that the focus of the new covenant on the inner person, right, the heart, was nothing new. It was not this focus on the heart and not being disobedient, rebellious, is no stranger to the old or the Mosaic covenant whatsoever. It was, in fact, I think that's a mistake that a lot of churches and pastors make. They mischaracterize the Mosaic covenant as just being about ritual and ceremony. God has always wanted the hearts of his people more than anything else. And that's why Samuel said, "Isn't it better to obey than to give sacrifices? Isn't it better than all of these things," right? Now, when it comes to this obedience, it was most important for the steward king to have the right heart, because as the heart of the king went, so too did the heart of the nation. We see this played out in the book of Kings over and over again, 1st and 2nd Kings, where Israel and Judah would have, or not Israel, but Judah would have a good king and the nation would turn back to God. They'd have a bad king, they'd turn to paganism, right? So the whole nation, it's almost like the king and the heart of the king was like the rudder of a ship. In whatever direction you turn the rudder, the ship would go in that particular direction. Now, I need to come back and fill in some of the backstory of how David got to be king. But for the moment, I still want to look at contrasting David's hearts with Saul's heart. The end of chapter 15 shows Samuel mourning for Saul. Right, despite Saul's failing, despite Saul's failing, I keep wanting to say Samuel when I need to say Saul, etc. Despite his failings, I think that Samuel had grown fond and very close to Saul. Chapter 16, 1 Samuel 16, begins like this. Now, and this is after God has torn the kingdom away from him, right? "Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, seeing that I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons." Now, let me just do this as an aside, because right now, our other study, we're going through Tim's Revelation series, and we're at the point where we're looking at, the kingdoms and the nations, and Daniel's prophecies, and we see these horns and these beasts with horns, and horns represent kings and kingdoms. And I actually think that the allegory and the parallel connects back here to where the ancient prophets would take their horn filled with oil, and they would go and they would anoint the king. I think that's why the prophetic books of Daniel and Revelation use the imagery of a horn to represent kings and kingdoms, right? And that's just kind of an aside. Let me get back to what I'm saying here. We're looking at the introduction to chapter 16, and God is saying to Samuel, how long are you going to be upset over this, right? I told you Samuel can't be the king anymore. I've got someone else. I've provided a king for myself. And we all know the story, right? Samuel goes to Jesse in Bethlehem. Jesse has 8 children, or 8 sons, and Jesse takes each of the 7 older brothers of David and brings them before Saul and son of Samuel. And Samuel waits for God to say, okay, this is the one. And God says, no, don't look at his appearance. Don't look at anything like what he seems like, because that's not the guy. And it keeps going, son after son after son. And finally, after the 7 older brothers, God has rejected every single one of them. Finally, Samuel says, like, is there anybody else? And Jesse says, yeah, well, there's David. He's out tending the sheep. So they call for David. When David walks in, God speaks to Samuel, and he says, that's him. That's the king. So take your horn and anoint him. Now, at this point, David is probably mid-teenager, somewhere around there. Scholars kind of debate this, saying anywhere from 10 years old to 14 years old. And they have some arguments that they make based on statements later about 3 older brothers being arrayed as part of the army to fight against Goliath, and we'll come back to that just in a second here. But it appears from how the story is written that after David is anointed by Samuel, that Saul doesn't know anything about this, right? All he knows is that God is taking the kingdom away from him, but he doesn't know who it is. He knows that someone's going to replace him, but apparently there's no indication that Saul was told that this little kid or young man named David has been anointed as king. I want you to go to 1 Samuel 16, verse 11. 1 Samuel 16, 11. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? Then he said, there remains yet the youngest. There he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send him in. We're not going to sit down till he comes. So he sent him in, or sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, which is dark complected, with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. And then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now what's happened here is that, it's not that Saul is no longer God's anointed, even though the Spirit of the Lord had departed from him. In fact, later, as an adult, David has a couple of chances to kill Saul, and he refuses to do it because he says, I am not going to be the one that kills the anointed of God. He refuses to do it. So David calls Saul the anointed of God, even after it says that the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul. David at this point is also anointed, right? Meaning that God has set him on a course, but that doesn't mean at this point he is king or he is stored, because he doesn't hold the throne. He doesn't hold authority. He has God's favor, and he's been set apart, but he is not yet king. Verse 15, Saul's servant said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is a skillful player on the harp. And it shall be that he will play with his hand when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. And so a servant comes and says, hey, I know this guy Jesse in Bethlehem, and he's got a son. And in verse 18, he describes the son as being David, of course, skillful in playing, implying the harp, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, a handsome person, and the Lord is with him. Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who is with the sheep. Now, I have always thought that it was a little bit unusual that if David was 14 years old and he was a shepherd, that the servant would describe him as a mighty man of valor and a man of war, prudent in speech. Well, what was he prudent in talking to the sheep that he's tending? And I'm going to point out just a couple of places where in 1 Samuel 16 and 17, even in 18, there are these kind of statements that make these 3 chapters a little bit clunky to read through. And I think there's a very specific reason for that. Now, in verse 17 or chapter 17, perhaps the most memorable story of David is in chapter 17 and 18. Of course, that's the story of David and Goliath. The Philistine army has gathered for war, and Saul and his army go out to meet them. It's important to know that Saul is out there with the army on the front lines. They're described as lined up on opposite sides of the battlefield, and this giant named Goliath comes out, and he's 9 feet tall, and he issues a challenge in what is called representative battle. This is what some of the ancient cultures did, is instead of going into full-scale war, each side would pick a champion, and the leaders would agree that whoever was the victor in that man-on-man singular battle would represent the battle of the entire armies, and they would agree to abide by the results. And in some cases, the victor would just kind of loot and take spoils of war. Sometimes they would take captives, and they would be servants. And so this is called representative battle, and this is what Goliath is doing, right? And we know the story, right? David comes up to Saul and he says, well, if nobody's going to go fight him, I'm going to go fight him. He says, I'm going to go fight against Goliath. And Saul tries to dissuade him, but after David tells him, you know what, being a shepherd out there, I have to protect the sheep, and I've killed a lion, I've killed a bear. I can take care of this guy. And so Saul finally agrees, and this is what happens. 1 Samuel 17, verse 38. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I can't walk in these, for I haven't tested them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Look at David's response. David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Again, we know the story. David takes out his sling. David slings the stone. It hits him in the head. In the Septuagint, it literally says that it penetrated his helmet and went into his forehead, and it knocks him out. Goliath falls down. David runs over, and he takes Goliath's sword, and he kills him, and then he cuts off his head. And the Philistine army scatters, and the Jews chase them. They kill some, they capture some, but it says that they plunder the Philistine camp, and they have this great victory. Now, the story has been used over and over and over and over again about slaying your giants, right? It's about, as a Christian, walking in the strength of God and looking at the things that are seemingly too big and insurmountable in your life and being trusting and obedient, and God will give you the victory. And I totally believe all that stuff. But this story also illustrates the differences between David and Saul and their character, the heart that God was looking for, that Saul lacked and David had in abundance. Both of them were at times faced with impossible odds. Saul, faced with this far superior army, panicked and disobeyed and made the unauthorized sacrifice because of his distrust. And he paid the price, yet young David faces down a 9-foot career soldier, and he goes out with a bunch of stones and a slingshot. And what was his battle cry in verse 45? I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. All this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's. right? This is the kind of steward that God was looking for to command and to be governing over his inheritance. Not the man who would panic at the first sign that the odds weren't stacked in his favor. That was the heart that he was looking for, and he found it in David, a very young man. Now, in this section, talking about Capricorn, we're working our way towards the Davidic covenant and why this part of the story is represented by Capricorn the goat. But before we get there, I need to show you some things in chapters 17 and 18. And chapter 17 and 18 is really the story of Goliath. If you're reading these chapters in any of the modern English translations that are based on the Hebrew Old Testament, which is pretty much all of them, right? Whether it's like the minority texts like the ESV, the NIV, the NASB, that kind of stuff, or even the New King James and the King James, they all have the Hebrew Old Testament as the manuscript tradition that the Old Testament is translated into English. And if you read these chapters, 16, 17, and 18, you come away with the thought that Saul is absolutely losing his mind. For example, David gets called from tending sheep, and the servant has described him as a mighty man of valor. Yet all the scholars are saying, well, he could be anywhere from 10 to 14 years old. David first is called into Saul's court to play the harp to calm Saul's nerves when he gets this distress. Then Saul gives David his blessing to go fight Goliath. He gives him his sword, he gives us his armor. But as David goes out, if you read a little bit, I think it's in 17, towards the middle and the end of 17, as Saul sees David going out to fight Goliath, Saul doesn't know who he is. And he asks his general, Abner, he says, who's that going out to fight Goliath? And Abner goes, I don't know. Let's try to figure it out. So what is it? Which is it? Is Saul just absolutely losing in his mind, and he's like got early Alzheimer's, and he sees David and he's in his court playing harps, and he grants him permission to fight Goliath and gives him his sword and his armor, and 10 minutes later he doesn't know who he is? Now, scholars, and there are a couple of other irregularities as you read through, and I would encourage you to do that if you haven't done it already. And these are some of the things that critics of the Bible point to go, your Bible doesn't make any sense. It's got all kinds of mistakes because here he knows David, here he doesn't know David, here he knows David. And they're like, well, this is evidence that the Bible is just written by man because there's all these contradictions. Scholars explain these irregularities as either being evidence of the effect of the distressing spirit that God sent to Saul, messing with his mind and his emotions. He's prone to these fits of rage, and then he forgets things, and he doesn't know who people are. Some other scholars suggest, well, maybe this just isn't written in chronological order, right? Which I get that argument because we see this in some of the prophetic books, certainly in the book of Revelation. We know Revelation is not written entirely sequentially and chronologically. So maybe the events in chapters 16, 17, and 18 are kind of, a little bit out of sync. But I am of another opinion. And I think this is, the confusion. The confusion lies in this. When you compare the Septuagint version of these chapters with the Hebrew Old Testament, there are about 39 verses, and I might be off by a verse or two, but somewhere around 39 verses that are in the Hebrew Old Testament version that do not show up in the Greek Septuagint. And in circumstances like this, we have to ask, well, what's the more accurate reading? Again, our fellowship, we tend to like the Septuagint, but here's the question, right? Did the translators of the Septuagint leave things out of the original Hebrew as they were translating the Hebrew into Greek? If so, why would they do that? What would be their motivation? What were they trying to hide? Or is the Septuagint Greek version faithful and the later Hebrew manuscripts have something added to the elements of the story? And if so, again, what's the reason? What's the rationale? But, just from an academic standpoint, remember that our oldest copy of the Hebrew Old Testament is about 1100 years after Christ. And the Septuagint was translated from Hebrew manuscripts that no longer exist, and this was done a couple of hundred years before Christ. And so the base text of the Septuagint is about 1300 years older than the earliest Hebrew Old Testament, right? And we also know that the Septuagint was translated by 70 Hebrew scholars that were commissioned by Ptolemy, King Ptolemy of Egypt, to put a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures into the library at Alexandria. Strictly an academic request, and I don't see any reason that the Septuagint translators would have intentionally left stuff out. And in fact, if you read the Greek version, it reads a lot more smoothly and without these irregularities that make you go, well, that doesn't make any sense. You don't get that when you read it in the Septuagint. Now, here's a list, and you can pause the video if you want, or just take a picture of the screen if you want to see. But here's a list of the verses just in chapter 17 and 18 of 1 Samuel that are missing. And I'll give you just a very quick rundown of what these are. In chapter 17, verses 12 to 31, that's a big chunk. That's the story. If you're familiar with David's story, if you've read it recently, this is the part of the story where it says that David was sent by Jesse to bring food to his brothers at the army or at the front line. And his oldest brother kind of gets on his case, why are you here? You should be tending the sheep. And as the men are talking around him, David hears the men say that whoever kills Goliath gets to marry the king's daughter, and his father will never have to pay taxes again. None of that is in the Septuagint. And these are the verses that are actually used to compute or calculate David's age to be around 14. And I'll tell you very quickly, and if you don't track me, that's okay. It's not really all that important. But in this account, it says that 3 of his brothers were at war. So scholars make the assumption that the rest of the brothers are too young. They all have to be under the age of 20. And they make the assumption that of those 3 brothers that are at war, the third eldest is probably right at 20 years old. And if Jesse had 1 kid every year and you count down to the 8th kid, then David had to be 14 years old. Yet the base text that's probably the most reliable doesn't even have that account in there. So can we definitively say that David was 14? No, we can't say that whatsoever. So I think we need to take this account with a grain of salt. In chapter 17, verses 41 and 50 are not in the Septuagint. They do not amount to any significant theological or doctrinal differences. It doesn't make any difference to the story if they're included or not. Chapter 17, verse 55, all the way through chapter 18, verse 5. This is where we see David going out to meet Goliath, and Saul sees him and says, "Who's that?" Yet in chapter 16, both the Hebrew and the Septuagint said that Saul gave him his blessing, gave him his sword, gave him his armor, and sent him on his way. Right? So neither Saul nor the general recognize him. So it's more likely that this was inserted later than actually was part of the original story. In chapter 18, verses 10 and 11, this is now after they've come back. David has killed Goliath. The whole town is going like, "Oh, David's so awesome. Saul's awesome, but David's like so awesome." Well, Saul has one of his fits of rage, and it says that he takes up a spear and he throws it to pin David to the wall. Well, that didn't happen in the Septuagint. Didn't happen. In chapter 18, verse 17 to 19, Saul says that he's going to give his eldest daughter to David, but he ends up giving that daughter to somebody else, which is why he later marries the second daughter, which is Michal, which is fortuitous because Michal fell in love with David. And it says that he makes David the head of his army, figuring that Philistines would kill him. Now, in the timeline, it kind of makes it seem like this happens fairly quickly after David kills Goliath. And if David is 14 years old, who in their well, of course, who in their right mind is going to make a 14-year-old the head of the army? And the final thing, and again, this doesn't make all that much difference in terms of doctrine and theology, but the last half of verse 21 is also not in the Septuagint. Now, this is a lot of stuff, and it just kind of makes us go back and maybe rethink the story. And I'm not saying that we have to change our mind about any great interpretational points, but I want to point this out because I have recently found myself in a position where somebody said, oh, the Bible is all full of errors. And of course, now when you ask them, well, show me one, they never can. They never can. But if somebody ever points out to you, and chances are this is not going to happen, because how many critics of the Bible are going to read the Septuagint that you run into on a day-to-day basis? But it's interesting for us because we like to study the Bible in depth and we like to know these things. Now, over the next several chapters, we see David growing more popular with every act he makes, right? He's just increasingly becoming popular among the army and in the general population. Excuse me. David now is married to Michal, Saul's daughter, but they have no children. Turns out later that she is not able to give David any children. David's best friend is Jonathan, who is Saul's son, also a military man. And Saul grows increasingly jealous and fearful. He sends David out against the Philistines and against other people, hoping that the enemies will kill David. But David is always victorious because God is with him and David is obedient and he trusts God. And finally things come to a head, and Jonathan, Saul's own son, helps David escape because Saul is planning on killing David at a banquet at what appears to be a feast day, because there's a reference to the new moon, a feast on the new moon. What ends up happening is that David spends several years moving from town to town, from camp to camp. His family and what later becomes known as the mighty men of David, they follow him. And at one point he has a small personal army of at least 600 men who are absolutely loyal to him. And so Saul is chasing him around the countryside because he's kind of falling in and out of these fits of anger, jealousy, and rage where he's like, I got to get rid of David. And I'm sure, even though it's not necessarily stated in the story, I'm sure that Saul is thinking, if I can just kill David, God will let me stay on the throne. And that's probably why he's doing this, right? But as David is roaming around the countryside, hiding from Saul, a lot of the enemies that Joshua had let remain in the land begin to see an opportunity, right? Several of them seek to betray David to Saul by giving away his position. Well, David's over here, we saw him over here, and several times Saul goes out to find David, yet David always escapes from him. I want you to go to 1 Samuel chapter 24 if you haven't already gone there based on what we see up on the screen. This is where we make the connection between the Mazzaroth sign of Capricorn, the goat, and the story of David, because we haven't seen that yet, right? So 1 Samuel 24, now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, take note, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. Now when we did this study years ago, when we first did the Mazzaroth, and when Tim published the book, The Mystery of the Mazzaroth, he goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to here about this place called En-gedi. And this is what En-gedi means. It's a Hebrew word that talks about, basically it talks about mountain goats. And it was kind of interesting when we did this at Oasis many years ago. Tim had some pictures of these mountain goats that are basically up on these crazy isolated pieces of rock at tops of mountains. And you look at the picture and you go, well, first of all, how did that goat get there? And second of all, how is that goat going to get down? But these mountain goats are incredibly sure-footed. and they can navigate the wilds, and they can get up there, and they can protect themselves and hide from natural predators. And this is part of how they survive. And this is exactly what David did. He was roaming the countryside, and he ended up going to this place called En-Gedi. And apparently, and I haven't looked lately, but En-Gedi, sometime in the last couple of decades, has actually been turned into a resort. And it has all these natural springs and lots of salt content, and people go there for rejuvenation. So that's the connection, right? En-Gedi, the rocks of the wild goats. This is where David hid. This is why Capricorn represents the story of David and ultimately the Davidic covenant. But as David is hiding out, Saul is told where he is, and so Saul tries to go get him. So in verse 3, this is where we see the first of two stories where David has an opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't, right? So verse 3 says, so he came to the sheepfolds, and this is Saul. He came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. Then the men of David said to him, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you. And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing that he is the anointed of the Lord. And so David restrained his servants with these words, did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. And David comes out of the cave and he calls out, and they talk back and forth, and Saul realizes that David had just spared his life, and he extracts an oath from David that he will not destroy Saul's family and his line, and he kind of promises that he wouldn't chase David, but of course that doesn't work out because Saul just doesn't keep his word. But it all happens again, right? Saul continues to go after David. David escapes, and one more time he has a chance to kill Saul, and he doesn't. He and another man, Ahimelech, they creep into a camp where Saul is asleep, and he's got a spear stuck in the ground, and he's got a water pot. And so they take the spear and the water pot, and they go out of the camp, and they call to Abner, who's the general. And David just kind of not pokes fun, but he's like, listen, dude, you're not doing your job. I could have killed Saul when I was right there. I've got a spear and I've got his water pot. You're not doing a very good job. I mean, he's kind of taunting him in that sense, but I believe he's very, very serious because of the respect that David had for Saul as the king of Israel. Even though the kingdom was going to be taken away, David was willing to wait on God's timing to let that happen. He wasn't going to go make it happen, kind of like the mistake that Saul made when Saul said, well, I got to figure out what's going on. Should I go to war? Should I not? Is God going to protect us? Samuel's not here. Let me go make the sacrifice myself. Now, I think I'm going to hold off right there. We're just a little bit over an hour. There's a couple of more things that I would like to talk about. But here's the key thing, is to focus in on the differences between the hearts of David and Saul and the reasons why their disobedience exacted different judgments, right? The mistake that Saul made was in his actions or inactions as the steward of the inheritance of God, whereas the main problem with David in his story with Bathsheba was the transgression of the moral law. He was acting beautifully well as the steward in the inheritance. In fact, it says several times throughout the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel that every time David went out, he behaved so well that the people fell in love with him more and more. So he was exactly what God was looking for, to be the commander of the inheritance of God. So let's leave it there for today. Look forward to seeing you in person next week. God bless and take care.